Hello, welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue in our long introductory series, I should say, to Revelation before attempting to address chapters and verse as advised by a number of modern teaching scholars. We need to understand the context of the time and place when written in order to comprehend the message the author is extending to his audience, several scholars tell us. So far, we have looked at the difficulty of Revelations, the authorship, and some other items, and today we address the dating of this book of Revelation. We learned earlier that scholars claim Revelation is actually an epistle or letter. But unlike letters of today, they were not dated in the first century. Thus, the exact date of the writing is unknown because the original manuscript is not available. One common school of thought is that, well, what difference does that make as to when the date? After all, it's written as prophecy for end of time. However, most respected modern scholarship rejects that school's hypothesis. Instead, they claim it was written to guide a particular early Christian's decisions in a specific time, place, and circumstance. Thus, it is near-term prophecy at best. Therefore, we need to discern that time, place, and circumstance to understand Revelation, not so much in its key message, but the particulars of the narrative, which is where most people tend to want to spend more of their time. Dr. Jerry Sumney at Lexington Theological Seminary suggests it is just such a failure to establish proper context of Revelations that has led often to its misinterpretation and misuse, especially a failure of the church to use Revelations to help show the need the needs that we have to help resolve the things around us in violation of God's will for humankind and its welfare, which is still a message needed today. Dr. Brian K. Blount, President and Professor of Theology at Union Theological Seminary in Richmond, Virginia, says we need to appreciate that the Christian audience that was addressed here in Revelation faced a time and place and circumstance that we need to understand, and that in order to accept this advice that's being received and to handle their situation as Christians, he was giving them this advice, which was not to react via the normal human instinct, he says, to fight or flight. No, it was to be nonviolent. Their witness to the world was to hold firm to their faith, even to their death due to it. And such is their efforts to make these changes in the world, and that we should try to make in this world, is a key message of understanding that we need to retrieve from this book of Revelation. The earliest traditions in Christianity dated to somewhere around 180 AD report that Revelation was written during the end of the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian. He ruled the Roman Empire near 81, his reign was from 81 to 96 AD. And the strongest modern scholarship dates Revelation's writing to about 95, 96 AD, which is about the same time that those early Christians in the 180 ADs were claiming it was written. Earlier dates have also been proposed with some supporting data, mainly centered around emperor-directed or what was perceived to be emperor-directed persecution that impacted selected groups of Jews and Christians, such as Emperor Claudius, who reigned from 41 to 50 AD, when he ordered Jews out of Rome. Emperor Nero's reign from 54 to 68 AD, when he accused Jews and Christians of causing the Great Fire in Rome. And the Jewish revolt period of 66 to 70 AD, when the Romans destroyed the Second Temple and massacred a lot of Jews and dispersed them to other places in their kingdom. Defense of all these dates, however, tends to center around persecution that would have included Christians, either within Judaism or as a standalone faith. However, it is important not to assume there was widespread persecution of Christians with these dates, any of these dates that I have given so far, throughout the Roman Empire. In fact, the data shows that it's very well established now that was not the case. Recent scholarship has concluded that it simply was not the case at all that there was general persecution prior to middle of the 200s, 250 or so AD. Instead, the Roman government was generally tolerant of indigenous religions, allowing the population to worship a wide range of faiths and their wide range of multiple gods and goddesses, as long as they also, and this is the key, also paid proper and approved homage to the Roman emperor as being divine. I am surprised later dates are not supported too. The latest date I found in my literature review was Emperor Trajan's reign of 98 to 117, with a possible date of writing maybe somewhere around 111, 112. But there's not much to suggest that it was written that late. The strongest argument for either Claudius or Nero's date might be an interpretation of Revelation 11, chapter 11, the first 3 verses, where some people would interpret that to imply that the Second Temple was still standing in Jerusalem. But of course, others will, suggest that that's symbolic language. All the earlier persecution seems to be confined to local situations and often involve Christians or Jews being singled out by pagans or pointed to by pagans, resulting in them facing trouble with the Roman courts, where they must, in a court or before a government official, an individual must demonstrate allegiance to the emperor and Roman rule. Even during Domitian's reign and before, historical scholars report only isolated and local persecution of Christians. Widespread persecution comes centuries later when emperors made a sustained and systemic and strong effort to root out Christianity. That effort ended in the middle of the reign of Emperor Constantine, when he adopted Christianity as a state religion and his own. And that was somewhere or another in the early 300s AD. Until about 250 AD, Roman persecution of Christians, according to historians, was sporadic and local. Dr. David Brake at Ohio State University also says until then, evidence indicates that persecution usually happened when a Christian was accused of either something and or ended up before the law and the courts, or needed to swear an oath of allegiance to Rome and the emperor. If they refused, he says, the data shows that the penalty was severe, usually either resulting in death or banishment. That appears to be what John's group is facing, he says, in 90s AD in Asia Minor. It is clear that John is addressing a situation and circumstance well understood by the 7 churches he writes to. Thus, he did not need to detail it here because they all understood what was going on. Instead, he focused on providing them with necessary reasons to sustain their faith, even if it leads to their death, instead of kowtowing to the Roman cult. Dr. Eugene Boring at Texas Christian University reports that we should appreciate that the data reflects that in Emperor Domitian's reign, he decreed that all government proclamations must begin with, and I quote, "Our Lord and God Domitian." Thus, the concept that the emperor was divine took on new life under him. So that tends to be, as scholars are pointing, the main change. A sudden, although this policy had essentially been there all along, it wasn't necessarily totally practiced. Wasn't too enforced except in isolated circumstance. But it becomes the rule of the land for all during his reign. It had been there since the 1st century, but was enhanced and enforced much more heavily during that period. He was to be addressed in all cases as Lord and God, and all transactions with his government were to so reflect that. Refusal to obey was concluded as you are an atheist and believe there is no God, for the emperor is not God, is what you're saying. We saw that also when we studied the Maccabees in the Apocrypha writings here a few years ago. But the Jewish temple during Rome's early rise, in other words, in 200 years before Christ, had negotiated an exemption for the Jewish faith early on. If we recall from reading in the Maccabees and some of those other books, the Jews recognized that Rome was the big boy coming on the block, so to speak, and they sent delegations there to negotiate a peaceful relationship with them. Thus, Christians were covered by that exemption as long as they were part of the Jewish religion, a subsect, if you will, of Judaism. But once the temple was gone in 70 AD and Christians moved on, for whatever that reason was, their faith became very vulnerable to the one God belief commandment they were forced to present themselves for, because they now had no exemption to cover them as the Jewish faith still had. Several scholars cite that in the 90s AD, Christians were under political, economic, and social pressures locally to formally venerate the image of Caesar. And this was as much based on local pressure for a community as it was coming from top down. For example, all gilded crafts and professions required that veneration, for example, as part of the gilding process, as did paying taxes, serving in the military, oaths before a court, or appearing before a court. However, for Christians to do so was a clear violation of the 10 Commandments, and they had no exemption for their faith. So what does a Christian do? Quit the faith using situational ethics and lie? by changing their religion somehow or another, going through a mock ceremony, or rebel and face the Roman army, which was the most dreaded in the world at the time. And of course, which if they did, the other side was then just go ahead and swear your loyalty and abandon the religious faith. But their loyalty, by belief, was to their Lord being Jesus Christ and their God being God the Father. So they were simply left with either violating their faith or failing to take the oath, or even swearing that they did not believe such. And then, based on very good evidence, large percentage of them would have been subject to death, or at best maybe banishment, as apparently John may have been. I hope this gives you some understanding of the situation that scholars are explaining to us, that they believe from the evidence that they can glean that Christians in the 90s AD would have been facing at the time they believe that Revelation was written. I hope you have a good week. Hope to see you again next week.